Now we're going to look at no market sale in the Neoclassical model. And it's going to work similar for the Keynesian model, except there won't be any pressure on prices to fall. So it's going to be same kind of scenario, except in the Keynesian model, monetary policy, restrictive monetary policy does not affect prices. In the Neoclassical model, it's going to reduce prices and GDP. Okay? So again, we're going to start off with making our demand curve. And here the shock parameter is a negative 95.2. The required reserves ratio is 20%. Demand deposits are 517 billion. So the intercept of our demand equation is 8.20. Remember, it's the sum of the shock parameter and required reserves. So required reserves added to the shock parameter. In this particular case, it's 8.2. Okay, so that's the intercept of demand. The slope of demand is 0.0005. 0.005. The reserves vertical section of the reserve supply curve is the quantity of reserves, which is $1,140 billion. The horizontal section is the discount rate. The discount rate is 100 basis points above the federal funds rate target, which is 2.5. So the discount rate would be 3.5. So the Fed sets the target at 2.5. The discount rate will be set at 3.5. And that kinks the supply curve down here. Okay, so I'll just go through this really quickly. You want to put IFF here, I subscript FF for the federal funds rate. That's the price of reserves. The quantity of reserves is R. This is reserves demand. This is reserve supply. The initial equilibrium is right here. And it looks like it's between 2 and 3. Let's close this out. We find it by plugging this value into here. So we're going to plug this value into there. So, whoops, equal 8.2 minus 0.005 times the 1140. So the federal funds rate is equal to 2.5 in equilibrium. It's equal to its target. Equal to its target. The quantity of reserves is $1,140 billion. So we'll hit enter and we'll get all that stuff correct. Okay, moving on to the market for money. I'm not going to label it, but I'll just say this is the money supply. And remember, this is money that people and firms have access to, whether they're through its currency or mostly demand deposits. So the money supply initially is here at 2140. The demand for money is here. And the nominal, I guess, prime interest rate would be this value plugged into there. So let's go ahead and do that. So equal 12.844 minus 0.0046 times 2140. So we get a nominal interest rate of 1.758. Or sorry, that's not right. 2140. We get a nominal interest rate of 3.0. So these two curves intersect perfectly at 3.00. So we're at 3.00 there, and the equilibrium quantity of money is the $2140 billion. Okay, and we hit enter, and then we move on to the Agri market model. So in this situation, if you notice, now the equilibrium is on the right side. It's on the right side of potential GDP. Real GDP is too big in the eyes of policymakers, right? Because what it'll do is it'll lead to inflation. If nothing's done, it'll lead to this inflation here, right? Because unemployment is too low. GDP is too high. The economy's grown too robustly. So we're going to go ahead and close that out. Again, this is the long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS. This is the short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS. And this is the aggregate demand curve, AD. This is real GDP. And this axis is the price level or inflation. So let's go ahead and close that out. So at the equilibrium here, GDP is 12.308, and that's more than potential. So the output gap is this 12.308 minus potential, right? And that's positive because we're in an inflationary gap. Okay, so the output gap is a positive 1.3, right? To get the price level, we can just plug the GDP level into our supply curve, which we're going to do here. We're plugging the GDP level at the equilibrium into our supply curve, and we get 217. So we're going to just say 217 here. And if we do the same thing up here, we'll get 217 as well, or something close to it. Because the unemployment rate is greater than, or less than, sorry, it's less than the natural rate of unemployment. The economy is said to be in an inflationary gap. Okay, the economy's in an inflationary gap. Let's see what happened here. The Excel over here had it set at 1 decimal place, so if we just add a decimal place, it goes to 1.26. Let's change that to 1.26. We should get it right now. Okay, good. Now to close this gap, because if the Fed does nothing, if policymakers do nothing, theoretically what's going to happen is the short and aggregate supply curve will shift out until the gap's closed. Okay? Because unemployment is low, firms are working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That puts upper pressure on wages and the prices of, like, say, energy. So these two things cause the short and aggregate supply curve to shift upward. Okay? And then would end up with inflation. So to prevent that from happening, what the Fed wants to do, the Fed wants to prevent that from happening. Okay? So the Fed wants to do this. It wants to push aggregate demand down. Whoops. It wants to push aggregate demand down, right? That's what it wants to do to prevent inflation. So we're going to close that. So to close the above output gap, the Fed conducts an open market sale. An OMS. And here the Fed is giving banks treasuries. In exchange, the banks give the Fed some of their cash, some of their reserves. So the Fed is soaking up reserves in the banking system. It's taking them out of circulation. So the Fed's going to conduct an open market sale to increase the federal funds rate target to 3.5%, or raise the federal funds rate target to 3.35%. So let's check that instead. There we go. Okay. Assuming this open market sale is equal to $170 billion, reserves are going to decrease to what? Well, we're going to subtract 170 off reserves, right? And what were reserves? Reserves were 1140, right? So we're going to subtract 170 off 1140. Okay. So reserves are going to drop down to 970. $billion. Okay. So reserves drop down to 970 billion. Now, because the target is going to be set at 335, that means the discount rate is going to be 100 basis points higher, or 1 percentage point higher, at 4.35. Okay? The quantity of reserves in equilibrium will be 970. because the demand curve crosses the new red supply curve on the vertical section. So that vertical section corresponds to $970 billion. Okay. What about the federal funds rate in equilibrium? What about the rate right here? We want to know what that is over here, right? What is that value? Well, we're going to plug in that 970 into our reserves demand equation. Okay. And our reserves demand equation was up here, right? When reserves was 1140, the federal funds rate was 250. But now with reserves being 970, the 8.2 is the intercept, if you remember, of the federal funds rate demand curve, reserves demand curve, and the negative 0.005 is the slope. We're plugging in the new value of reserves, and we get an interest rate of 3.35. So the federal funds rate will increase to 3.35. Okay? And that equals the target, doesn't it? That equals the target. Equals the target. Okay? We'll hit enter and make sure that we got everything correct. And it looks like we do. Now, the open market sale was $170 billion. So, and the multiplier is 1.71. Okay. So we're going to multiply the decrease in reserves by the multiplier. And we get 290.7. So the money supply, this is what the money supply is going to drop by. The money supply decreases by that amount. The multiplier times multiplied by the open market sale. Now the money supply was 240 billion, right? That's what it was on the black line right here. We're going to reduce it by that amount. So when we reduce it by that amount, whoops. We're going to reduce the old money supply by this amount. We get what? We get that 1,849.3. Okay. And then we got to plug this value into the demand for money, right? We got to plug it into the demand for money. And the demand for money is right here. I'm going to take this and copy it into Excel. And we're going to multiply that slope by that quantity of money. And we get a nominal interest rate of 4.337. So, the open market sale decreased the quantity of reserves. It decreased the quantity of money, which increased the nominal prime interest rate from 3 it increased it to 4.337. Okay, so the change in the nominal prime interest rate, 4.337 minus 3, is 1.337. So if we hold expected inflation constant, holding that constant, the nominal rate of interest increased by this amount here. That means the real rate of interest will increase by that same amount. Okay, so the real rate of interest is going to increase by 1.337. And then because interest rates are higher, that's going to decrease. That decreases investment expenditures. increase or decreases exports, and all that together will decreases agri demand, and you see that down here. Agri demand falls. Okay. Now, as agri demand falls from this point here, from this equilibrium point down to this equilibrium point, prices are falling along the short agri supply curve, and GDP is decreasing. So real GDP decreased as well. The price level decreased, and the unemployment rate increased from a very, very low level, below the natural rate, to equal the natural rate. So the unemployment rate is going to increase, and the unemployment rate increased. Okay, we'll make sure we got everything right here. Yep, we got everything right. Okay, so that's an open market sale, and again, it works the same way for the Keynesian model, except short and aggregate supply has a flat line. So, let me change it to black. So if this were a Keynesian question, what would happen instead is that instead of short and aggregate supply being a vertical line, short and aggregate supply would be, or upward sloping line, short and aggregate supply would be a so you just erase the short and aggregate supply curve here, right? So if this were a Keynesian model, you just do this, right? Okay, and so the GDP would go from here down to here, and so as a result, prices wouldn't change, but GDP would decrease and unemployment would increase. Okay. Okay, that's an open market purchase in the neoclassical model.